What if the most famous reinvention in Hollywood history began not with a casting call, but with a quiet, legal execution? What if the birth of a goddess required a human sacrifice? Because before Marilyn Monroe could step into the light, Norma Jeane Dougherty had to die. And the studio wasn't the only one holding a shovel. The air in Van Nuys, California in 1942 tasted of orange blossoms and looming war. It was a world of neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and the comforting hum of domesticity. Inside a modest bungalow on Nebo Street, a young girl was playing house. She cooked pot roast, starched her husband's shirts, and fussed over their cocker spaniel, Muggsy. She was a wife, a neighbor. She was, for the first and perhaps the only time in her life, perfectly and terrifyingly normal. Her name was Norma Jeane. Her husband, Jim Dougherty, was 5 years her senior, a neighborhood boy who worked at Lockheed Martin before the war drums called him to the Merchant Marine. He was steady. He was kind. He was her anchor in the relentless storm of a childhood spent in a dozen foster homes and orphanages. He represented a safety she had never known, a quiet harbor where the ghosts of her past couldn't reach her. She loved him with the desperate gratitude of a survivor who had finally found dry land. She wrote him loving, girlish letters when he shipped out to the Pacific, filling the pages with neighborhood gossip and dreams for the home they would build when he returned. She promised to wait. She promised to be true. She was Mrs. James Dougherty. And for a fleeting moment, that was enough. It was a life drawn in soft pencil, a simple sketch of a future. But history is written in ink. The war effort needed women, and Norma Jeane needed a purpose to fill the empty hours. She took a job at the factory, inspecting parachutes and spraying fuselages with fire retardant. The work was monotonous, the noise deafening. It was a world away from her quiet kitchen. It was also the place where fate, disguised as a U.S. Army photographer, came looking for a pretty face to boost morale. His name was David Conover, and he was on assignment for Yank magazine. He walked the factory floor, scanning the hundreds of faces, but one stopped him cold. A girl with a radiant smile, whose youth and vitality seemed to defy the grim reality of the factory floor. He didn't see a housewife. He didn't see Mrs. Dougherty. He saw a symbol. He saw a star. But this story of discovery, the one polished and sold by the studios for decades, has a crack in its foundation. The marriage to Jim Dougherty wasn't a teenage romance born of passion. It was an arrangement, a desperate measure brokered by Norma Jeane's guardian, Grace McKee, to prevent the 16-year-old girl from being sent back to an orphanage when Grace's family had to move. Jim wasn't a lover she chose. He was a lifeboat. The camera lens became her new mirror, and in its reflection, she saw a person she didn't recognize, but one she desperately wanted to be. Conover's photographs were a sensation. Soon, other photographers came calling. Then came the Blue Book Model Agency, a finishing school for girls with big dreams and the right bone structure. They taught her how to smile, how to pose, how to walk. They taught her how to lie. The agency head, Emmeline Snively, sat her down in a sterile office that smelled of perfume and ambition. The advice was simple, brutal, and absolute. A model's greatest asset is her availability. She must be a blank canvas onto which men can project their fantasies. A husband, Snively explained, was a smudge on that canvas. A backstory, an inconvenience. To sell the dream, the girl next door couldn't belong to the boy next door. She had to belong to everyone, and to no one. So Norma Jeane picked up a pen. On her first modeling contract, in the neat little box beside the words, marital status, she didn't hesitate. She wrote, single. With a single word, she performed a magic trick. She made her husband, the man fighting a war thousands of miles away, vanish into thin air. This wasn't a slow, sad drifting apart. It was an execution. Jim Dougherty was on a ship in the South Pacific when he saw her. He was thumbing through a stack of magazines with his shipmates when he froze. There, on the glossy pages of a pin-up calendar, was his wife. Her hair was different. Her smile was for a million other men, but those were her eyes. The name printed beneath the photo was Jean Norman. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. His shipmates whistled and made crude remarks about the girl in the picture, never knowing their friend was married to her. He was her husband, but to the rest of the world he was just another fan. The letters from home grew less frequent, the loving prose replaced with a breezy, detached tone. She wrote about her new career, about the exciting people she was meeting. She never mentioned the contract. She never mentioned the lie. Jim wrote back, confused and hurt, pleading for the girl he had married to come back to him. He was writing to a ghost. The person he was writing to was already gone, replaced by a beautiful, ambitious stranger who was learning that the truth was just a commodity, something to be bought and sold. When he finally returned to Los Angeles in 1946, the city felt different, colder. He went to their small house on Nebo Street, expecting a welcome home kiss from the girl he'd left behind. Instead, he found an empty room and a letter on the kitchen table. It wasn't from Norma Jeane. It was from her lawyer. She was filing for divorce. Years later, after she had become the most famous woman in the world, a reporter asked Dougherty about his legendary ex-wife. His response was chilling, a quiet indictment of the entire Hollywood machine. "I never knew Marilyn Monroe," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "And I don't claim to. I knew and I loved Norma Jeane." He was drawing a line in the sand. He was stating, for the record, that the person he married and the person on the silver screen were two different entities. One was real, the other was an invention. And in his mind, the invention had murdered the original. The studio, 20th Century Fox, couldn't have been more pleased. They had signed this breathtakingly beautiful young woman, this Jean Norman, who they would soon rename Marilyn Monroe. Her divorce was a blessing, a final severing of a tie to a past that was useless to them. They began to construct her new history, the one the world would come to know. The narrative of the lonely orphan, discovered by pure chance, a diamond in the rough plucked from obscurity. In this new story, there was no room for a first husband, no room for a quiet life in Van Nuys. Jim Dougherty, the anchor, the lifeboat, the first man she ever promised forever to, had to be erased. He was a loose end in a story that demanded a mythical beginning. Studio publicists worked tirelessly, feeding the press a carefully curated biography. They spoke of foster homes and hardship, painting a picture of a girl who had always been alone, who belonged to no one until she belonged to the world. They didn't just change her hair color, they changed her history. The machine was efficient. The erasure was almost total. To the millions who fell in love with Marilyn Monroe on screen, she was a creature of pure light, born, fully formed under the Klieg lights of Hollywood. The housewife from Van Nuys was buried in an unmarked grave of forgotten facts and studio lies. But ghosts have a way of rattling their chains. While the world knew nothing of Jim, Marilyn, it seemed, could not entirely forget. Friends from that era would later recall moments of strange, haunting nostalgia. A fleeting mention of "my first love," a sad, distant look in her eyes when she saw a young couple walking hand in hand. She once confessed to a friend that her deepest desire was not for fame or fortune, but for a simple home, a place where she wouldn't have to be Marilyn all the time. The very life she had so ruthlessly discarded. Was it a clean break? A calculated career move she never looked back on? Or did the specter of Jim Dougherty and the simple life he represented haunt the halls of her Beverly Hills mansions for the rest of her short, tragic life? The evidence suggests something far more complex. The amputation of her past was not clean. It was a wound that never truly healed, and it would fester in the darkness for years to come. While Marilyn was ascending into a stratosphere of illusion and fantasy, Jim Dougherty came home and planted his feet firmly on the ground. He needed a new life, a new purpose. He found it in the unglamorous, unforgiving streets of Los Angeles. He joined the Los Angeles Police Department. He became a cop. The irony was staggering, a plot twist worthy of a noir film. The woman he knew was living a life built on carefully constructed fiction, a goddess in a city of broken dreams. Meanwhile, the man she erased dedicated his life to uncovering the truth. He investigated robberies, homicides, and missing persons. He dealt in facts, in evidence, in the brutal, tangible reality of life and death. They lived in the same city, breathing the same smog-filled air, but they occupied different universes. She was Hollywood's most celebrated secret. He became a keeper of everyone else's. He would see her face on billboards, on the cover of every magazine, a constant, unavoidable reminder of the girl he once called his wife, now a stranger with platinum hair and a different name. He never reached out. He never spoke to the press. He simply did his job. A quiet, stoic figure moving through the city's underbelly while his ex-wife entertained its kings. For 16 years, their separate worlds spun on, never colliding. Hers, a vortex of fame, scandals, and powerful men. His, a steady rhythm of shift work, crime reports, and the quiet satisfaction of a solved case. He remarried, had daughters, and built the very kind of normal life Norma Jeane once claimed to want. He was a ghost from a past she had ordered buried. But the past never stays buried, especially not in Los Angeles. In 1962, the worlds of the movie star and the cop would finally, violently collide. On August 5th, a call came into the West LA Police Division. A possible overdose, a celebrity death. When the first officers arrived at a quiet hacienda in Brentwood, they found the body of the most famous woman on earth, naked, alone, and clutching a telephone. Dougherty wasn't the responding officer. By then, he was a seasoned detective, far removed from patrol duty. But in the weeks and months that followed, as the official story of her probable suicide began to crumble under the weight of contradictions and missing evidence, a whisper started in the halls of the LAPD. A whisper about the first husband, the cop who knew her before she was Marilyn, the one man who might know the truth behind the lies she told, and the lies that were being told about her death. Because the official narrative, the one spoon-fed to the public, had a fatal flaw. It ignored the body buried back in 1946. The first victim, Norma Jeane Dougherty, remained silent, a stone wall of professional detachment. But his colleagues knew. They knew he possessed a unique key to the psychodrama that was her life. He understood the frightened, insecure girl hiding behind the global icon. He knew who she was when the cameras weren't rolling. He knew her fears. He knew her secrets. And now, he found himself in the chilling position of being a detective whose most famous unsolved case was the woman he once promised to love, honor, and protect. The studio had given her an ultimatum all those years ago. A choice: your husband, or your career, your past, or your future. She chose the future. She chose the fame. She signed the papers, took the new name, and walked into the blinding light, never looking back. But the choice wasn't that simple. It came with a clause she couldn't read in the fine print. In choosing to kill Norma Jeane, she had unknowingly signed her own death warrant. The forces she invited into her life to help her erase her husband were the same forces that would, 16 years later, erase her. Dougherty believed this. He saw a direct line between the divorce papers of 1946 and the coroner's report of 1962. To him, the Kennedys, the mob, the studio heads, they were all just vultures picking at a carcass. The fatal wound had been self-inflicted years earlier, in a lawyer's office, with the stroke of a pen. But there was one detail he held back, a secret he kept for over 30 years, something that never made it into any official report. It was a memory of the last time he ever heard from her. It was a phone call, late at night, just a few months before her death. Her voice was slurred, terrified. "They're not going to let me have him, Jimmy," she'd sobbed. "They know about us." He had assumed she was talking about DiMaggio, her second husband whom she was rumored to be reconciling with. But she didn't say Joe, she said him. And then she said something that made the blood in his veins run cold, a phrase that made no sense then, but would haunt him for the rest of his life. She whispered, "The first one is always the hardest to forget." The first one. For years, Dougherty turned that phrase over and over in his mind. The first husband. It had to be him. It was the only thing that made sense. She was reaching out to her beginning, to the last time she was ever truly safe. But what if he was wrong? What if, in his grief and his history, he had missed the real, terrifying meaning of her last words? What if Marilyn Monroe, the world's greatest actress, was delivering one final, coded performance? Think about it. Why would she use such a cryptic phrase? The first one is always the hardest to forget. It's not how a panicked person speaks. It's a line, a piece of dialogue. Who was she talking about? And more importantly, who was she talking to? She knew her phone was tapped. The FBI, the mob, Hoffa's people. Her privacy was an illusion. Was she leaving a clue? Not for Jimmy, the ex-husband cop, but for the history books. For the bugs in her own wall? The official story of her death is a house of cards, and that phone call is the gust of wind that blows it all down. They told us she was despondent over a fading career. A lie. She had just been rehired by Fox, signed a new 2-picture deal, and was planning a musical version of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. They told us she was a washed-up drug addict. A distortion. Yes, she took pills for anxiety and insomnia, prescribed by doctors who kept her on a leash. But an autopsy found her organs to be in near-perfect condition. This was not the body of a long-term, chronic abuser. They told us she swallowed a bottle of Nembutal, a physical impossibility. The coroner, Drive Thomas Noguchi, found no trace of the pills, yellow dye in her stomach, zero residue. To get the massive dose found in her liver, she would have had to swallow upwards of 50 capsules. There would have been evidence, but there was none. It meant the drugs entered her body another way. Noguchi himself later admitted his probable suicide finding was made under duress. He suspected the drugs were administered via an injection, or, more likely, an enema. This wasn't a suicide. This was a procedure. It was a professionally administered hotshot, designed to kill without leaving a needle mark. It was murder. So who had a motive? The list is a who's who of 20th century power. The Kennedys, terrified she would expose her affairs with both Jack and Bobby, revealing state secrets she'd overheard in moments of pillow talk. Mob boss Sam Giancana, who used Marilyn as a pawn to entrap the Kennedys, enraged that she was no longer useful. Teamster leader Jimmy Hoffa, who saw her as leverage against his mortal enemy, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. They all had a reason, but Dougherty's mind kept returning to that call. "They're not going to let me have him, Jimmy." He fixated on the him. Joe DiMaggio? Bobby Kennedy? But what if the him wasn't a person at all? What if him was a placeholder for something else? A child. Marilyn was desperate to be a mother. It was the one role she craved more than any other. She suffered through multiple miscarriages, each one a devastating blow to her fragile psyche. Her last one, in 1958, nearly broke her. Was she pregnant again in the summer of '62? A Kennedy baby would have been more than a scandal. It would have been a political nuke, an heir that could bring down a dynasty. And then, the second part of the phrase. The first one is always the hardest to forget. Dougherty thought it was him. But Norma Jeane's life was a litany of firsts, a catalog of traumas. What about the first time she was abandoned by her mother, Gladys, to an orphanage? The first time she was sexually abused as a child? In a foster home? What if the first one was the first secret she was ever forced to keep? The secret of her mother's paranoid schizophrenia. Gladys Baker was in and out of mental institutions for most of Norma Jeane's life. It was the great, terrifying shadow that loomed over her existence. She lived in mortal fear that she carried the same bad blood, that one day she too would be locked away. It was why she fought so hard to control her own image, her own narrative. The studios helped her bury this secret. They invented a story that her mother was dead. It was cleaner, more tragic, more marketable. So from the very beginning of her career, Marilyn Monroe was a character built on a foundational lie about the person who gave her life. She erased her mother, just as she erased her husband. This is the key, the pattern of erasure. Anyone who represented the inconvenient truth of Norma Jeane had to be cut away. First her mother, then her husband. But in 1962, the past was coming back with a vengeance. Her mother, long institutionalized, was becoming more lucid. And Bobby Kennedy, a man who built his career on taking down organized crime, was an expert at digging up dirt. He knew how to find secrets. Did he find the biggest secret of all? Not just the affair, but the truth about her family, her mental health, the very instability the studio had spent millions to hide? A mentally unstable mistress to the president was one thing. A mentally unstable mistress who knew state secrets and was potentially pregnant was a threat to national security. She was no longer just an actress. She was a liability. The girl who was an expert at keeping secrets was now a secret that had to be kept permanently. The men she had trusted to build her future were now the men who had the most to gain from erasing her entirely. Dougherty, the cop, understood this logic. It was the cold calculus of a crime scene. When you have too many loose ends, you cauterize the wound. You eliminate the source. And Marilyn had become the source of everyone's problems. But even this horrifying political explanation doesn't quite explain the sheer strangeness of that last phone call. The first one is always the hardest to forget. It still feels like a riddle. What if we've been looking in the wrong place? What if the secret wasn't about the Kennedys, or the mob, or even her mother? What if it was something that happened long before all of that? A secret buried so deep, only one other person on Earth knew about it. Let's go back to 1942. A 15-year-old girl named Norma Jeane is living with a family friend, Grace Goddard. Grace is her legal guardian, but Grace and her husband are moving to the East Coast, and they can't take Norma Jeane with them. The only alternative is to send her back to the orphanage. There is, however, one other option: marriage. She's introduced to a handsome, 20-year-old neighbor who works at a local factory. A steady, reliable boy. His name is James Dougherty. The solution is simple. If she marries him, she won't be a ward of the state anymore. She'll have a home. She'll be safe. It was, for all intents and purposes, an arranged marriage to keep a girl out of the system. He liked her. She was a sweet, shy girl who stuttered a little. She liked him. He was kind and treated her like an adult. But it wasn't a grand romance. It was a lifeboat, a practical solution to a desperate problem. And this is where the story gets strange. Because, according to some biographers, according to whispers that have persisted for decades, there was a reason Grace Goddard was so desperate to marry Norma Jeane off so quickly. It wasn't just about the move to West Virginia. It was about another man. Grace's husband, Doc Goddard. There have been persistent, dark rumors that Doc had been abusing Norma Jeane. That the marriage to Jim Dougherty wasn't just to keep her out of an orphanage, but to get her out of that house, away from him. If this is true, it reframes everything. The stutter, the insecurity, the desperate need for love and validation. It all snaps into focus, and it gives that final phone call a new, gut-wrenching context. The first one is always the hardest to forget. The first abuser. The first man who broke her trust. The first monster. And what about the other part? They're not gonna let me have him. Who were they? And who was him? Could it be that in 1962, with her life spiraling, she was trying to finally confront her past? Maybe she was using her newfound power and connections to investigate Doc Goddard, to get some form of justice. And maybe they, the powerful people around her who depended on her stable, marketable image, found out. They couldn't let their biggest star dredge up a sordid story of childhood abuse. It would destroy the fantasy. It would be a PR nightmare that would tarnish the brand forever. In this version of the story, him is not a lover or a baby. Him is justice. Him is the truth. And they, the studio, the handlers, the men who owned her, were not going to let her have it. They needed Norma Jeane's secrets to stay buried. And if that meant burying Marilyn Monroe along with them, so be it. So which is it? The mob? The president? Or the monster from her childhood? Perhaps the most terrifying answer is all of them. Marilyn Monroe didn't die in a vacuum. She died at the nexus, the exact point where the glamour of Hollywood, the power of Washington, and the darkness of her own past converged into a perfect, fatal storm. Each secret made the others more lethal. She was a woman who knew where the political bodies were buried, who had shared a bed with the mob, and who was threatening to unearth a private trauma that would shatter the billion-dollar fantasy the world had paid to see. She wasn't just a loose end. She was the thread that could unravel everything. For the Kennedys, she was a political time bomb. For the mob, she was a witness. For the studio, she was a damaged asset, threatening to default. In the cold boardroom of power, the decision becomes simple. It becomes logical. You don't fix the problem. You eliminate it. They didn't want to kill Marilyn Monroe. They had to, because Norma Jeane was about to tell her story. And so we are left here, in the quiet of her final bedroom, surrounded by ghosts and whispers. We search for a single killer with a single motive, because a conspiracy is easier to comprehend than the truth. The truth is that the system that created her, the very machine that promised her everything, is the same one that consumed her when she became inconvenient. She wasn't murdered by one person. She was destroyed by an idea. The idea that a woman's body, a woman's image, a woman's life is a commodity to be shaped, sold, and ultimately discarded. In the end, the question isn't, who killed Marilyn Monroe? The real question is, what did? And the answer is us. Our obsession, our fantasies, our insatiable need for a storybook goddess, with no room for the broken girl who was screaming to be saved. We demanded a fantasy, and Norma Jeane paid the price. The lights that guided her to stardom were the same lights that blinded her, leaving her alone on a dark road with nowhere left to turn. The boulevards of Hollywood are paved with forgotten stories and broken dreams. To make sure none are ever truly lost, subscribe to Boulevard_of_.